In the summer of 1893, a mechanical engineer named Thomas Waverley walked into a pavilion at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago and spent 4 hours examining a machine he could not explain. He had been sent by his employer, the Westinghouse Electric Company, which had recently won the contract to illuminate the entire fairgrounds, to assess whether a particular exhibitor's device posed any electrical interference risk to the main grid. The device was approximately 9 feet tall, fabricated from copper and brass, and mounted on an insulated platform of hard rubber roughly 2 inches thick. It had no engine. It had no boiler. It had no visible power source of any kind. It was connected to nothing. And it was running, not intermittently, not as a demonstration, continuously, from the morning the pavilion opened to the evening it closed, day after day, for the duration of the fair. Waverley watched it for 4 hours. He measured a steady output of electrical current from its 2 terminal posts, not a trickle, not a residual charge, but a functional current, consistent enough that he could have lit a lamp from it. He wrote 9 pages of notes. He sketched the machine from 4 angles. He returned the following morning with a second engineer, a man named Frederick Gorst, to repeat his measurements. The readings were the same. When Waverley submitted his assessment to Westinghouse, he was told the device presented no interference risk and that the matter was closed. He asked about the source of the current. He was told that question was outside the scope of his assignment. He never saw the machine again. The exhibitor's name was not listed in the official fair catalog. The pavilion it occupied appeared on no floor plan filed with the Exposition Authority. By the time Waverley tried to locate it a third time, 3 weeks into the fair, the pavilion was gone. The space it had occupied was empty. No dismantling crew had been logged. No removal permit had been filed. The official record of the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago is one of the most comprehensively documented events of the 19th century. More than 27 million people attended. Hundreds of exhibitors were cataloged, their inventions recorded and reviewed by a panel of judges whose assessments were published in a 12-volume official report. That report covers electrical exhibits in considerable detail. It was, after all, the fair at which alternating current was introduced to the American public on a grand scale, and the competition between Tesla's ACT system and Edison's DC technology was the defining technical drama of the moment. And yet the 12-volume report contains no entry for a self-sustaining electrical device. It contains no entry for a copper and brass machine mounted on a rubber insulation platform. It contains no reference to an unnamed pavilion on the fairgrounds. Thomas Waverley's name appears nowhere in the official documentation of the exposition. Frederick Gorst's name appears nowhere. 9 pages of field notes and 4 technical sketches went somewhere after Waverley submitted his assessment. They did not go into any Westinghouse archive that has been made publicly accessible. The Westinghouse corporate records, held at the Carnegie Mellon University Library, donated after the company's dissolution, show a gap in the engineering assessment files for the period April through November 1893. Not missing pages. A gap. The filing sequence skips. The documents on either side of the gap are intact. Whatever was filed during those months is not there. Before we go further, if buried investigations like this are something you want more of, hit subscribe so the next one reaches you when it drops. The algorithm tends to suppress this kind of research unless you tell it you want it. To understand why the machines that appeared inside American World's Fairs between 1876 and 1901 matter, and why their disappearance after 1900 follows a pattern that the official history of technology has never examined, you have to understand what World's Fairs actually were during that period. The standard account describes them as celebrations of industrial progress, competitive showcases where nations and corporations displayed their latest achievements to demonstrate commercial and technological dominance. That account is accurate, but it is incomplete in a way that becomes visible only when you look at who was allowed to exhibit outside the main catalogs. Every major American exposition of the period maintained two classes of exhibitors. The official class was cataloged, judged, and published in reports that are still accessible today. The unofficial class, referred to in internal exposition documents by various terms, most commonly as special demonstrations or invited presentations, operated in pavilions that were not assigned permanent floor plan positions and were not subject to the standard documentation process. These unofficial exhibits were not open to the general public on the same terms as the main floor. They were accessible by separate admission, by invitation, or during specific hours that were not publicized in the general program. The exposition authorities acknowledged their existence only to the extent necessary to manage the physical logistics of their presence on the fairgrounds. Their contents were not the exposition authorities' concern. They were not evaluated by the official judging panels. They were not described in any official publication, and yet they occupied real space, drew real crowds by whatever invitation process governed them, and left real physical traces that have been disappearing from the archival record, piece by piece, ever since. In case after case, across 6 major fairs between 1876 and 1901, what was inside those unofficial pavilions appears, from the fragmentary evidence that survives, to have been unlike anything in the official record. And what is remarkable is not simply what was there. What is remarkable is the precision with which it was kept out of the documents. A machinist named Orville Stearns worked as a general maintenance contractor at the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition of 1876, the first World's Fair held on American soil. His job was to move equipment, repair fixtures, and respond to mechanical failures across the fairgrounds. Stearns kept a work diary for the duration of the fair, a habit he had maintained since his apprenticeship, recording each day's tasks, the equipment he worked on, and the locations he visited. That diary, 218 pages, was held by his family until his granddaughter donated it to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania in 1941. The diary is still there. It is accessible. And in its entries for 3 specific weeks in the summer of 1876, Stearns describes being called to service equipment in a section of the Machinery Hall Annex that he had not previously been permitted to enter. He describes machines he cannot name. He describes one device in particular. He calls it the resonance column, which appears to have been his own descriptive term, as a vertical assembly of concentric metal rings, each one slightly smaller than the one beneath it, rising to a height of approximately 12 feet and terminating in a pointed copper apex. He was called to tighten a mounting bracket at its base. While he was working, a man he describes as the operator adjusted something at the device's midsection, and the column began producing what Stearns describes as a tone. Not a sound exactly, but a sensation in the chest, a pressure that was felt rather than heard. A second man in the room, whom Stearns identifies only as the German gentleman, wrote something in a notebook when the sensation began. Neither man spoke to Stearns while he worked. The entry ends with Stearns noting that he was escorted from the annex by the same man who had called him in, and that when he attempted to return to the annex 2 days later to retrieve a wrench he had left behind, he was told by a guard that the section was closed to maintenance staff. The resonance column, whatever it was, does not appear in the official catalog of the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition. The Machinery Hall Annex is mentioned in the official records only in terms of its dimensions and general function. No device matching Stearns's description appears in any patent filing of the period that has been publicly catalogued. The German gentleman with the notebook has never been identified from Stearns's description alone. But Stearns was not the only person who left a record of the annex. A journalist named Harriet Folsom, who covered the fair for a Boston periodical, mentioned in her personal correspondence letters held at the Massachusetts Historical Society that she had been approached during the fair by a man who offered her access to an unofficial demonstration that she would, in his words, find more interesting than anything on the main floor. She went. She was there for approximately 2 hours. She wrote a 2-page account of what she saw in a letter to her editor dated August 14, 1876. She described machines that she could not categorize as belonging to any industry she recognized. Not steam, not clockwork, not any of the electrical apparatus she had seen on the main exhibition floor. She described an atmosphere in the demonstration space that she called electric in the literal sense. She could feel her hair responding, she said, and there was a taste in the air like before a thunderstorm. She noted that no wires were visible and no generator was present. The machines were simply running. Her editor wrote back, asking her to develop the account into a publishable piece. She was a skilled technical writer, and he recognized the potential of the story. Her reply, dated August 22, said only that she had decided the subject was not one she wanted to pursue in print. She gave no reason. She offered no alternative explanation. In 20 years of professional correspondence, it is the only time she declined an editor's request without explaining herself. She never returned to the subject. The 2-page letter she wrote on August 14 has a water stain across its final paragraph that renders the last 3 sentences unreadable. The stain is old. It was there before the letters were donated to the Historical Society. Harriet Folsom put that letter in an envelope and mailed it, and whatever she had written at the bottom of it was already obscured before it arrived. St. Louis, 1904, workers dismantling the Palace of Transportation after the Louisiana Purchase Exposition report finding, in a subfloor cavity beneath one of the unofficial pavilion sites, a copper component approximately 18 inches in length, whose function none of them can identify. The component is turned over to the Fair Authority's Property Office. The Property Office issues a receipt. The receipt exists in the St. Louis Exposition Archive. The component does not. Buffalo, 1901, an electrician named James Calloway is hired for a single day to connect a grounding line to an unofficial exhibit 2 weeks before the Pan American Exposition opens to the public. He describes the exhibit in a letter to his brother as a machine that collected something from the air. His specific language, it pulled from the air the same way a pump pulls from a well, except there was no pipe and no reservoir that I could see. He wrote that when the grounding connection was completed, the operator, a man who had not spoken to him during the entire job, turned to a second person in the room and said, in a tone Calloway described as entirely ordinary, that it was holding. Just that word, holding, as though the machine reaching a stable state was the unremarkable conclusion of a routine process. Calloway was paid in cash. No employment record for the day was filed with the Exposition Authority. The letter to his brother is postmarked September 4, 1901, 2 days after President McKinley was shot at the same exposition. But here is what makes the pattern of these accounts different from isolated curiosities. The midpoint of the timeline is not the beginning or the end. It is 1893, the Chicago World's Fair, the exposition where Thomas Waverly measured a continuous electrical current from a device with no power source, where a pavilion vanished from a fairground that tracked the movement of every piece of lumber. What Waverly described in 1893, what Stearns described in 1876, and what Calloway described in 1901 are 3 independent accounts. From 3 different fairs in 3 different cities, each one describing a machine that performed a function its observer could not explain using the technological vocabulary of the era. They do not describe the same machine. They describe the same category of machine. And that category, whatever it was present at every major American exposition for 25 consecutive years. And then it was not. This is not coincidence. This is a pattern. The Smithsonian Institution's Division of Mechanical and Civil Engineering received, between 1905 and 1912, at least 4 separate submissions from private researchers attempting to document the technology exhibited in unofficial capacities at American World's Fairs between 1876 and 1901. The Smithsonian's responses to all 4 submissions are on record. All 4 were declined. The stated reason, in each case, was the same: insufficient primary documentation. The Smithsonian did not offer to assist in locating primary documentation. It did not refer the researchers to other archives. It did not indicate what standard of primary documentation would have been sufficient. It declined, and it closed the correspondence. The Smithsonian has never explained why its own holdings of fair-related mechanical documentation for the period 1876 to 1901 contain no reference to unofficial or special demonstration exhibits of any kind, despite internal administrative records from multiple expositions, records that the Smithsonian itself holds, that confirm such exhibits existed and occupied physical space on fairgrounds, that the Smithsonian documented in every other respect. It is never explained why the Westinghouse engineering assessment files for April through November 1893 contain a gap in the filing sequence that corresponds precisely to the duration of the World's Columbian Exposition. It is never explained why every major American World's Fair between 1876 and 1901 featured unofficial exhibits that operated outside the standard documentation process, and why, after 1901, that category of exhibit simply ceased to exist at American expositions entirely, not declined, not reduced, gone, as though a decision had been made, as though something had changed. Why would the organizers of the most comprehensively documented public events in American history maintain an entire class of exhibits that they deliberately kept outside the documentation process? Why would a mechanical engineer employed by the largest electrical company in the country be told that his question about the source of a measurable electrical current was outside the scope of his assignment? Why would a journalist with an offer of exclusive access to something genuinely remarkable decide, within 8 days and without explanation, that it was not a subject she wanted to pursue in print? Why does the pattern stop at 1901? The honest answer is that we do not know precisely what was demonstrated inside those unofficial pavilions. What we do have is a machinist's diary describing a device that produced felt vibration without visible mechanics, a journalist's letter describing literal electrical charge in a room with no visible power source, an electrician's description of a machine that pulled from the air, and a copper component whose receipt survived while the component itself did not. And we have the endpoint, 1901, the last year the category existed. Whatever was being demonstrated in those spaces, and whatever arrangement had permitted it to be demonstrated, ended at the Louisiana Purchase Exposition in 1904. And even then, the St. Louis Fair is the last one whose demolition records contain any physical trace of what had been there. Thomas Waverley died in 1921. His 9 pages of notes and 4 technical sketches of the copper and brass machine were not among his estate when his widow inventoried it. His widow told a neighbor, and the neighbor recorded this in a diary entry that survived into the possession of a local historical society, that in the months before his death, Waverly had been trying to write something down about a thing he had seen in Chicago 30 years earlier. She said he had filled and discarded several pages, sitting at the kitchen table late at night. She said he seemed frustrated, not with what he remembered, but with his inability to find words that felt adequate to what he had witnessed. She did not know what he had been trying to describe. She had asked him once. He had said only that it was something that should have changed everything. He said it quietly, as though he were not entirely sure whether he was relieved or sorry that it had not. The official history of American technology tells us that the period between 1876 and 1901 was the age of Edison and Tesla, of the dynamo and the generator, of power delivered through wire from a central source. What the maintenance diaries, the private letters, the gapped filing sequences, and the missing copper components tell us is that something else was also present during that same period, in the same buildings, at the same fairs, in the rooms where the documentation process had been deliberately suspended. Whatever it was seen by enough people to leave a trail. And the trail ends, precisely and completely, at 1901. Subscribe and share this with someone who still asks why certain things stopped when they did. History does not disappear when it is buried. It disappears when the last person who saw it stops trying to find the words. Next week, I am following the trail of a patent application filed in Washington in 1899 by an inventor whose name appears in none of the standard histories of the period. A man named August Rell. The application was received. It was assigned a number. It was never processed. The number still exists in the Patent Office Index. The application does not. You will not want to miss it.